Ladies and gentlemen, be a good moment to get underway. Thank you, John. So we'll try and get underway in a timely fashion. Good evening. On est très content que vous êtes ici. Apparemment, pas mal d'entre vous ne sont pas membres du Conseil national du Canada. On va régler ça bientôt, j'espère. My name is David Dement. I'm the president of the Canadian International Council in Ottawa, and it's my privilege to welcome you here. Seeing as a good number of you are not perhaps that familiar with the CIC, let me tell you just a few things. We began in 1928, so quite historic. There are 15 branches across Canada. Of course, this is one. And in Ottawa, we are the largest of the branches. We have almost 350 members. We have 10 programming teams, of which this is one. And in any given week, say for July and August, we have very possibly 3 events happening in 1 week. So that there's a lot of study groups or working groups. So if you, this is one of the things that might attract you to becoming a member and being able to go to these other events, which are the Chatham House Rule in many cases, and are really quite enriching to attend, and you can deepen your knowledge and contribute as well. So to join the CIC, you can go to our currently styled website, thecic.org, or we have at the back there by the water jugs a number of these forms. And then we have a very excellent person who works with us called Snooki Lomo, who will no doubt take your form. And that's a good, efficient way to get the thing done right away. So those forms are at the back table. Now let me tell you a little bit about the events which are upcoming. On Monday, April 18th, the Politics in the Pub, which is one of our programming teams and really quite interesting, is having an event on Canada and Iran. I feel like adding more information to each of these, but I don't want to hold you guys off any longer than necessary. On Wednesday, May the 4th, we have a most interesting speaker. The Office of Sir David Owen in the House of Lords reached out to us, and Sir David Owen is going to be speaking in Toronto, and we are going to have him speak to us on Wednesday, May the 4th, in this very room. And he, as you may know, some of you are younger, but I certainly remember him as someone interested in all these kinds of things, as a former, and as many of you know, a former very eloquent and a striking figure to this day. Just go online and you see him. He's quite something. A Minister of Foreign Affairs for the UK, founding leader of the Social Democratic Party. And he has come to the view that the UK, perhaps surprisingly from that perspective of the center-left, should in fact leave the European Union. And he's written about it, and he's passionate about it, and he's going to be speaking to us about it as our next event in this room. And that will be on Wednesday, May the 4th. On Wednesday, May the 18th, we've tried to keep these events as apart, and this is the best we could do. Bill Graham, the Canadian former foreign minister, who is the chair of the CIC nationally, of the 15 branches and the various things that we do. We have a journal and a website and so on. He has an autobiography which is launching, and so it will be hot off the press, and it's really well written and apparently goes into quite a lot of insightful detail. So that will be an opportunity to be at the launch. The book will be for sale on Wednesday, May 18th. And then our final event, spring will clearly be here and summer on its way. Thursday, June the 9th, will be our annual general meeting, and then Ambassador Bruce Heyman, who is the US ambassador. And a significant event, because when he first did a gathering like this, he answered some questions by someone who perhaps wasn't thinking of his best interests, and got himself in a little bit of trouble. So I'm sure with the change and the shift of relations between our two countries, that'll be an interesting opportunity, and I'm sure we'll have CPAC coverage and may say something important for our most important relationship as Canadians. For tonight, the Twitter handle is taken from countering violent extremism. So it's hashtag CVE at CIC-Ottawa. I'd like to thank the Sheraton, as you can see, and AV Canada, who both give us favorable rates as a civil society organization of citizens trying to contribute to our society. Those two organizations have taken this up in a similar spirit and given us a favorable rate. So thank you to them, to AV Canada. I hope they're still paying you your proper fee, or your hourly fee in any case. Now, what we've all been waiting for, the opportunity to introduce tonight's panel. And Rafal Rosinski is chairing the panel. He's a senior fellow of the Institute of Strategic Studies in London. He's the CEO of SecDev. He's the co-founder of the SecDev Foundation. He's joined our board, so we're very happy about that. Thank you for all the great contribution you're making, including tonight. Very many of our flagship events, the politics and the pub people are saying, hey, don't stress so much. You're the flagship events where we don't want to be undermined. So we're doing other good things too. And increasingly, our working groups are organizing these dinners and these events. And this is, in fact, the case with Rafal, who is also launching a working group, which he'll tell you more about. And tonight's topic, as we know, is urban terrorism, violent extremism, and the internet shaping Canada's response. And I pass all of that to your capable hands. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, David. And thank all of you for showing up on a Tuesday night in Ottawa after Easter in such numbers for this panel. On behalf of the CIC and also of the SecDev Foundation, who's also co-sponsoring this event, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's panel. In recent years, there's rarely been a week that's gone by without some account of violence splashed across our headlines, whether it's been the Madrid train bombings, attacks in London, Paris, Ottawa, or just last week in Brussels. What sets these acts apart, what's captured our imagination, is that these are deliberate acts of political terror, indiscriminately aimed at civilian populations, and they occur in the midst of our urban environments. There are also differences in terms of who is responsible for perpetrating these acts. Increasingly, we're led to understand that the modern extremist is not a made man in the mafia sense, inducted and recruited into covert organizations, but rather these are volunteers, individuals, who seek solace in communities in and through the internet, find the cause, and ultimately are willing to shed blood for it. But is this new phenomenon of urban terrorism aided by the internet really anything new? Is there any indication that this is a new normal, as much a leitmotif of globalization as it's Starbucks or the cell phone? The trouble with extremism is that it strikes a highly emotional chord. Terrorism is the politics of fear. And while it may be true that all is required for evil to triumph is for good men to say nothing, it is also true that in politics, what begins with fear usually ends in folly. So what is the new normal? Is it the targeting of our cities? Is it an appeal to violent extremism? Is it the fault of the internet? And most importantly, to cite Lenin, what is to be done? The recent case that pitted the FBI against Apple Computer over providing codes to decrypting terrorist cell phones really strikes closer to home. A debate over powers, and there are no easy answers, only hard choices. Tonight, we're privileged with this exceptional panel of individuals well positioned to debate these matters. To my right, Shauna Coxton, Inspector Shauna Coxton, is a 20-year veteran of the Toronto Police Service, where she is currently second in command of the Intelligence Service, a unit of over 235 people and a budget of $26 million responsible for the most sensitive aspects of policing in Canada's largest metropolitan centre, which includes cybercrime, counterterrorism, hate crime, covert source management, and operational intelligence. Shauna is by no means an ordinary police officer. Prior to her latest assignment, she led the service's move into cyberspace, implementing its cybersecurity or cybercrime section, and leading the service's initiative to engage in social media and open source investigative techniques. She's won numerous accolades and citations for her work on youth crime, child abuse, sex crime, human rights, and intelligence analysis. But that's not all. Shauna also holds a PhD in criminal law from Leicester University and regularly publishes and lectures on the topic. She is passionate and committed as a professional, and in her spare time has volunteered for multiple international trips to places like Kenya, Uganda, Thailand, and China. Welcome, Shauna.
Thank you.
To the right of Shauna, we have Dr. Robert Muggah, PhD. Now, some friends of ours describe Robert as the Indiana Jones of academia. Name a hotspot in the last 20 years, Robert's been there. Name a warlord, gunrunner, narco-criminal. It's likely that Robert's met them. He's the author of hundreds of articles, tens of books, and more policy papers than one could reasonably expect to read in a lifetime. Among his accomplishments, he was a co-founder and director of the Small Arms Survey, and is currently a director of the Igarape Institute in Brazil and a director of research, I'm proud to say, of the SecDev Foundation. Rob is also a fellow of the University of Oxford, the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and the Catholic University at the Rio de Janeiro, University of San Diego, Canadian Institute of Global Affairs, and TED. In 2013, Rob was named as one of the top 100 most influential people working on violence, and in 2014, he gave a very influential and interesting TED Talk on fragile cities. His research and data visualizations on homicide, arms, and cities have been featured by media around the world. He's written more than 6 books, and I can go on and on and on, but perhaps best leave you with a few salient facts. Among his friends are Richard Branson, and he once used to live downstairs from Shakira. Welcome, Rob. Last if not least, Misha Glenny will be known to all of you for his work on the Balkans and also on the globalized crime. Now, if Rob is to be compared to Indiana Jones, Misha actually is Indiana Jones for his deeply personal one-on-one investigations of what drives the soul of men. Misha's work as a journalist spans more than 2 decades in countless of the world's dark spaces and dark souls. He's perhaps best known for his 2008 book, McMafia, where he left no stone unturned tracing the evolution of global crime by actually going out and meeting the people engaged in it. His book estimated that approximately up to 15% of global GDP could be accounted for by the global underworld. Misha's latest work examined one of his latest works examined the rise of cybercrime, but his latest book, Nemesis, paints a picture or a portrait of a young man rising from Rio's favelas to the heights of the Brazilian underworld. Misha's deeply personal portraits of people, motivation, actions, open up a world beyond the headlines and is always worth listening to. Misha, thanks for making the trip from London all the way here. So panelists, let's start. First of all, there has been this assumption that urban terrorism is the new normal. But is it really so? Rob, amongst all of us here, you've probably spent the most time as a scholar trying to get your mind around what exactly is violence and whether this is a new social phenomenon or old social phenomenon. Compared to other forms of violence, how is violent extremism different or the same?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the very kind invitation. And it's a delight to be back in Ottawa, a city that I grew up in, actually, and spent a fair amount of my life and education. Let me try to quickly answer with an anecdote first, which is that I live in Brazil now, in Rio de Janeiro in particular, and I flew from Rio to Ottawa last night and arrived this morning. And one of the wonderful things about making that trip, especially the part between Toronto and Ottawa, because you have to take 3 flights, is you get all the newspapers in the Lester Pearson Airport. So I got the National Post, I got the Globe and Mail, I got the Ottawa Citizen, Toronto Star, and I read them all. And you can catch up pretty quickly on what's going on in Canada in about half an hour reading those papers. And I can say that as a Canadian. And what was striking in reading the papers was that about 40% of it was devoted to terrorism, the threat of terror, the Belgian attacks, the Lahore attacks, the threats in our cities, and I got really nervous. I'm thinking, make this plane land quickly because I'm not quite sure if I'm feeling safe in Canada. And I come from a country right now that has 60,000 homicides every single year. So 1 in 10 people who die violently every year is a Brazilian. I come from a neighborhood south of Mexico where 1 in 4 people who are killed violently are Latin American, come from one of four countries, Colombia, Brazil, Venezuela, or Mexico. So we don't feel nearly the kind of threat and risk, or I certainly don't feel in a day-to-day the threat and risk that I felt this morning on my flight over from Toronto to Ottawa and making my way from my room in the Sheraton downstairs. But to answer your question, or to the extent that I can answer your question, I'd start by saying, yes, there is, or there has been in the last decade, last 15 years, a quantitative growth and expansion in the extent of terrorist violence. And I think one way of measuring terrorism or conflict or other forms of criminal violence is by looking at death and violent deaths in particular. And so if you go back to 2001 and you look over the last 15 years, you've gone from about 3,000 to 4,000 people dying violently in terrorist, in inverted commas, acts to about 30,000, 35,000 people last year who died violently in what might be described as terrorist acts. That's a significant increase, and there's been a significant increase in the last year. The important thing, though, is to think about how is that distributed and who are the perpetrators. And I think the first thing to say is that about 75% of that 30 to 35,000 people dying violently are dying in just 5 countries: Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, and Nigeria. Just 4 actors account for well over 50% of those violent deaths. That's Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Boko Haram, and the Taliban. So I think it's important to consider the distribution, the geography, and the perpetration, and who's responsible. The other thing I think it's interesting to note is that the tactics have changed somewhat to not just targeting groups and individuals, but actually targeting cities. Cities, it's not just ethnic groups or minorities or individuals within cities, it's the city itself that is increasingly becoming the object of much of this terrorist-related violence. And I think the shift in tactics is something that's interesting we've seen over the last couple of years. Now, if I compare that to other forms of violence, I think it's important to understand the prevalence of terrorist-related violence is very, very low. Your likelihood of dying from a terrorist act in North America, Western Europe, the cities that you mentioned, Raphael, in the beginning, is thousands of times less than dying from a car accident or dying from some kind of illness, heart disease. It's very, very low, well below the global average or even the national average for homicide. The average of dying from conflict-related violence, there are about 25 to 30 countries around the world that are currently at war, is even just marginally higher. And again, highly concentrated in a few countries. Now, the likelihood of dying from a homicide is much, much higher. Now, Canada is relatively low, but far higher around the world to die from interpersonal violence than it is to die from a terrorist act. So I think it's really important we have this conversation, that we have a balanced and data-driven discussion about what the relative threat level is, depending on the type of violence we're talking about.
Now, Shauna, you work in Canada's largest metropolitan centre, and invariably these issues and the fears that they spawn are not just something which is abstract, but actually something quite real. The Toronto 18, after all, did happen in Toronto, and invariably these are issues that you have to make an assessment over also in terms of where you put your policing emphasis. So is this an issue that keeps you up at night?
No, and in fact, we had this discussion earlier today just before we came down here, and it's interesting to me that, for example, in Toronto right now, shootings are up 20%. So, my day-to-day concern is mainly around sort of gang violence, because about 65% of shootings are either known to be or suspected to be gang-related. So terrorism is something we consider low risk, but high impact because of the specter it creates. And because of that, people are quite taken with it, and that's part of the intention of the tactics that are used. That's why people stay up at night and worry about it, and that's why it's garnered so much media attention. But if we look at a data-driven analysis, it is very low risk at this time. I mean, I'm not going to say very low. I mean, the overall threat assessment for Canada is medium. Toronto is medium. But the fact is we have very few of these instances. But I do think that regular people are talking about it at the kitchen table. They are concerned about it, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. We get communities talking about it and discussing it and looking at policy and that kind of thing. But no, it doesn't keep me up at night. In fact, I often tell my team, I live in downtown Toronto, so I'm like, listen, if we get this wrong, I won't be here tomorrow. So, it's really important we get it right. So, no, it doesn't keep me up at night.
So, Misha, these are numbers and these are obviously impressions, but one of the things that sets you apart maybe from the other panelists is that you've actually spoken to people who are extremists, who have engaged in violence and have done so knowingly and willingly. What Shauna said about this being a low incidence but high impact event obviously it does have consequences for us as a society because we react politically to things we see as a stress. What do you see maybe qualitatively different over the last 20 years of talking to extremists in terms of how they may have changed, how this has evolved?
Well, I think I'll start by going back to Yugoslavia. And incidentally, just to give a plug to David Owen, because I didn't realize that David was coming here. I worked with David quite a lot when I was in Yugoslavia. And although we disagree fundamentally on the United Kingdom leaving the European Union, and I was quite surprised when he came out about that. He's the only person I've heard arguing for what we call a Brexit from a really considered and careful analytical point of view. Everyone else tends to use emotive arguments about it. It's just a brief point, but as I was thinking about Yugoslavia, I remember David, who did tremendous work in Yugoslavia. But Yugoslavia was very important for the following reasons, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of how it relates today. The Yugoslav conflict started off as a power struggle within one part of the Yugoslav Communist Party in the late 80s, the Serbian Communist Party. It then mutated into a struggle within the whole of the Yugoslav Communist Party and the relationship between Serbia and Croatia in particular. But this was all being carried out on a fairly elite level. And then at some stage, what happened was that the fracturing state of Yugoslavia, or the fracturing states of Yugoslavia, attempted to persuade its citizens to back an extremist project. And the state in Serbia and the state in Croatia inverted the usual role of law and order in the state. And it sent out the message through the media and through other means that murder was permitted of certain people and it would be sanctioned by the state. And the reason why I point this out is to point out just how quickly people can move from, in an apparently in inverted commas civilized country as Yugoslavia was, from social behavioral norms which are perfectly acceptable to the great majority of us, to behavioral norms which are completely horrifying and which include sort of genocidal activities and so on. And within these, I interviewed quite a lot of the people who were involved in this. One of the people I interviewed on fairly early on, before he was known to the outside world, was General Ratko Mladic, who was the Bosnian Serb military leader. Mladic, I don't believe that all Yugoslav leaders were psychopaths at all, but Mladic, I believe, had psychopathic tendencies. And I asked him about his life, and one of the things that kept on coming up was about how he'd led this itinerant life in the army, and how he would he would be stationed in somewhere like Skopje in Macedonia, then in Belgrade, then in Zagreb, then in Sarajevo. And he said he never really felt part of these cities. One of the phenomena of Yugoslavia, particularly in Bosnia, was to see how cities were targeted. That you saw a revenge of the peasantry in Yugoslavia who felt they'd been excluded from power in Yugoslavia. And during the war, they were taking out their anger at the cosmopolitan cities, which was the part of Yugoslavia that most people outside Yugoslavia knew. And Mladic was definitely doing this. He never felt part of Sarajevo. He always resented Sarajevo and other cities. And I'm reminded of this, and incidentally, a lot of radicalized British youth mentioned Bosnia as the first moment when they felt as though they were being affected by international events. Bosnia-Herzegovina and the tardiness with which the international community responded to what was going on in Bosnia. The reason why I mention this is partly to underline the importance of the role of the state when it comes to levels of violence and response of citizens to violence, but also to highlight the issue of disaffection of Muslim communities in Europe and the problems that we now face in Europe as a consequence. If you go to the banlieue in Paris, you really are going into ghettos. I mean, these places are ghettos where the state not only has no purchase, but it has no interest at all. And it is so easy in those circumstances, particularly when you see, first of all, an economic boom in which the majority of the French population is gaining, is winning, but you're in that part of the population which is not winning very much. And then when you have a bust after 2008, because of the economic crisis, you see your circumstances collapse much more rapidly than those people in the middle of Paris, the people who are not from your community. This has been terribly important in Europe in the creation of radicalized Muslim young men in particular, but it's one of many causes that we've seen of extremism in Europe. But the issue of the state for me needs to be center stage. When the state reneges on its responsibilities, or for example in the 1990s when the states in Eastern Europe collapsed after the collapse of communism and vacuums appear, that is when you are in maximum danger of unelected, unaccountable political movements which seek to fulfill that vacuum that has been created. So whilst we can look at it on the one hand from the point of view of networks, individual motivation of young people, various actors in this thing, the role of the state is always going to be a key responsibility in the way that society is moving in general.
Well, you raise a really fascinating question. I've actually got two follow-ups for both of you, Shauna and Rob, and maybe I'll start with you, Rob. You just recently done a really fascinating study looking at the fragility of urban environments. And I think one of the counterintuitive findings that you were able to surface is that even in stable states, you have highly unstable urban areas. And conversely, in highly unstable states, you can have some very stable urban areas. So how does this actually compare to Misha's point that there is a responsibility of the state in terms of changing norms around violence?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing we need to be perhaps careful of in our conversation also is what we mean by terrorism, who qualifies within that large bandwidth. There's been a tendency in the last 10, 15 years to expand the definition of who constitutes a terrorist, versus who qualifies as an enemy combatant, say, for example, to the point now where often we hear commentators in the United States and parts of Europe suggest that most of the deaths in places like Iraq or Yemen or Syria are in fact terrorist-related deaths, when in fact it might be quite legitimate contestation of power, legitimate again, inverted commas, between ostensibly guerrilla groups or insurgent groups against a repressive or oppressive or absent or neglectful state, as Misha described. So I do think it's a dangerous and slippery slope that one has to be careful of. And of course, being precise on definitions is critical for being able to define the magnitude, scope, and scale of the problem that we face. But to get to your point, what's been interesting over the last couple of decades, really in the last 50, 60 years, has been the acceleration of urbanization on the planet, and specifically in the South, the global South. There's been a dramatic increase in the number of people turning to the city, to the point we have 65 million new urban residents every year around the planet. What's interesting is that we're seeing a relative stabilization or maturation or even decline of urbanization in the West. By West, I mean North America and Western Europe, but an acceleration in parts of South Asia, Africa, and even the Americas, where we're at about 85% urban. And so people are moving to cities in greater speed and scale than we've ever seen before. And this is generating enormous stresses on the ability of states and not just at the national or federal level, but at the state and in particular the municipal and metropolitan level, to cope with this kind of turbo urbanization that we're seeing. It's overwhelming the capabilities of states to be able to respond adequately to people's needs. It's creating new forms of habitation and conurbations between urban localities. It's stressing government and governance and the ability of authorities to be able to respond adequately. It's generating new forms of inequality and new forms of impoverishment. There are some analysts out there who talk about this rapid urbanization and even the production of slums as being potentially a positive development. Economists like Ed Glazer at Harvard, for example, talks about the existence of slums being an example of the positive nature, the pole nature of cities, and that it's almost a necessary part of the urban transition. I live in a place where roughly 1/5 of the population lives in a slum, and it's very difficult to put a romantic spin on life in some of these areas, and Misha, I'm sure, can reflect on that. But just to emphasize that what we often see in many of these very fast-growing, irregularly and fast-growing cities is a hyper-concentration of risks, or an accumulation of risks that often can translate into the negligence of the state, but also the propensity of young people, especially young males, to join into extremist-type activity. And what are those 4 risks? And I won't go into great detail because we'll have a chance to talk about it some more. But some of those risks include things like inequality, hyper-inequality. The obvious example that Misha raised about seeing your neighbor, literally your neighbor, doing much better than you are, is something that I think people are becoming more aware of, not just physically in real life, but online as well. You're becoming much more exposed to this sort of hyper-inequality. The youth bulge, this sort of dangerous agglomeration of young males without opportunity, with no clear and evident horizons. I think that lack or absence of horizon is critical to the likelihood or propensity to engage in extremist activity. You also have the speed of urban growth, the pace. When you go above about 3.5 to 4% in terms of growth per year in a city, that's a very dangerous warning sign. And so having these kinds of clustering effects of these let's call it pathologies in the urban space, tend to reproduce certain forms of violence, and violence in organized violence, the kind of violence that we're now seeing increasingly in Toronto, this gang violence. And one final point. There are about 55,000 cities, we think, give or take, in the world right now. There are about 2,100 plus minus cities over 250,000 people. The vast majority of those cities are growing at a breathtaking speed in the global south. We tend to focus only on the 30 or 32 global cities, the mega cities, the ones that are sort of mesmerizing in their size and scale. But we know very little about what's happening in the vast majority of smaller and medium-sized cities that are going to, I think, generate tomorrow's challenges. So, this is a huge blind spot, I think, for us globally as a community, especially in parts of the South, where I think the vast majority of so-called extremist terrorist violence is concentrated.
So Misha raised a good point about social exclusion being one of the sort of drivers of extreme behavior. And I think one of the things that stuck in my mind from last week's Brussels events was the extent to which the individuals involved were not committed jihadis. That these were young men who had very secular lives, who at some point in time suddenly switched. Mubin Sheikh, commenting on that, seems to have laid claim to the idea of gangsta jihadis, the gangsta culture somehow melding with this new identity. This is an issue for unintegrated populations everywhere. And as Rob rightly pointed out, in Toronto, we've had problems with unintegrated communities. How do you see that dimension perhaps becoming more to the forefront as a risk in Canada?
Well, I think it's a salient point. I mean, one of the things we have in Toronto that's so unique is we have so many different communities. It's such a woven mosaic, and I say that because you can be in one police division, and we have 17 in the city, and you can be in one corner of that particular division, and the community can look completely different, and I'm talking about economics and social makeup and age, and it can be completely different than another area, even in that same division. So it becomes very difficult from a policing perspective because you're not dealing with a community. You're dealing with, multifaceted types of communities, and how do we really gain public trust in each of those communities? Because I would suggest that each one views the police differently. We have a different relationship with each of those communities, and certainly the fragmentation is, I think, really important, not just for the issue of extremism, but we know that when you are of a particular class, you can't get ahead, there's social exclusion, there's lack of opportunity, that is associated with different types of violent crime. So gang violence, for example, is significant when those factors come into play. And I think it's important because I do think that, for example, the issue with Brussels is that when we look at these types of events, we typically see that you have people at risk, young people at risk, and I say that because they're vulnerable. There's been a conflation of different things that have happened in their life. There's a real sense of dissatisfaction with a number of things around them, including the state, including police, and that's why so often, people in uniform are targeted. It's symbolic, and at that point, then you can get into a number of different things. This is one of them, and this right now I think is very. I'm going to use the term sexy. There's a real sort of sense of this has meaning, and it's filling a gap. But I think that if this wasn't there, that another gap would be filled, whether that's gang membership or something of that nature. It's the same sort of void.
So, Misha, Al Gore has claimed that he invented the internet, but in 2008, in the book McMafia, you certainly highlighted the role of the internet as a catalyst to what you saw as a new form of global crime. Effectively, you were arguing that the internet is changing the way that global criminality can operate. Do you still stand by the fact that the internet has changed fundamentally the way that crime operates, and by extension, the way that violent extremism has changed?
It's gone in a slightly different direction, in as much that since then I've come to the conclusion that there is a fundamental difference in the nature of what I call traditional organized crime, and cybercrime. And that is that in traditional organized crime, if you want to enter the game, you have to have the ability to wield or to credibly threaten the use of violence. And if you're engaged in cybercrime, stealing people's identity or their credit cards in large number and stuff like that, you can do that from your home in Kazakhstan against a victim in Los Angeles, and you can cash out the money in Dubai. And there is no need for violence. And so what I observed with that is that pure cybercrime like that was attracting a very different type of social personality. It was not the usual guys with thick necks and wielding baseball bats. It was young people who often become incrementally involved in cybercriminal activity in their early teens, before their moral compass has been properly formed, and they find themselves to be deep inside it by the age of 16 or 17, and it's an environment that they become familiar with, and they are using their particular skills, be they math skills, computer skills, what we call social engineering, persuading other people to do things with their computers which are not actually in their interest. So you have two separate forms of crime that emerge in that sort of one grows up alongside the already existing one. What I think you're going to be seeing much more of now is, first of all, cybercrime is becoming more organized in itself, so that groups engaged in cybercriminal activity will create offices. Some person will be responsible for deploying malware on a computer. Somebody will be responsible for laundering the money. Someone will be responsible for the original phishing attack, persuading somebody in a company to press on a link which downloads the malware, and so on and so forth. What we're also at the very beginning of is a fusion between traditional organized crime and cyber criminal activity, with traditional organized crime beginning to understand the value that cybercrime can add to their traditional activities. We've seen this most of all in large drug cartels in particular, but also in pedophile rings, and so on and so forth. It certainly transformed the nature of crimes against sexual crimes committed against children beyond belief in the past 20 years or so. When it comes to the issue of extremism and jihadis, we started talking about Brussels. Now, I'm living in London. We have Paris in November. It's very easy to go backwards and forwards between London and Paris on the Eurostar. Ditto with Brussels. We had the attack in 2005 on the London Underground. This is really quite close to home. It's very important to stress what Rob said, first of all, that you're very unlikely to be the victim of a terrorist attack. But if you're living in London and Brussels happens, 24/7, whether you're looking at watching conventional television news or whether you're on Twitter or whether you're on Facebook, you get nothing but information about the Brussels attack. And then 3 days after that, we hear the news in London that the intelligence services foiled an attack by a group of 3 recently radicalized jihadis in West London who wanted to attack Shepherd's Bush Police Station and Shepherd's Bush Town Hall, both of which are 100 yards away from where I live. And my son, who's 18 years old and who's been following politics since as long as I can remember, was clearly extremely agitated about this because it was going to be a drive-by shooting on the Uxbridge Road, which is the main road which passes the street off where we live, literally 100 yards away. And so what you can observe is the psychosis, and the psychosis is what the aim of these terrorist attacks is, more than the actual, the people involved are arbitrary. Really interesting was the Pakistani attack in some respects, because the stated motivation was to attack Christians at Easter. In fact, more Muslims were killed in that attack than Christians. Secondly, what they were doing was trying to show to the traditional Taliban from which they had broken that they were equally as powerful and capable of committing atrocities like this. Thirdly, it was to show the Prime Minister of Pakistan that they could attack in his home constituency. So there were a whole series of messages that they were trying to get through, which they can do with social media, which actually have nothing to do with the victims of the attack, if you see what I mean. So this is part of a very sort of complex politicized use of terror, which individuals like my 18-year-old son or the people of Brussels or the people of Paris, perfectly understandable, may not grasp.
This issue of adeptness, though, on the internet, I think is a really fascinating one. And Rob, I think we started off this conversation by at least a little bit of ground truth, saying that, look, the quantitative issue of terrorism is really quite minuscule. But while there may be tens or maybe hundreds of what we would classify as people engaged in political terror online, there are literally thousands who are involved in gang violence in Latin America. And the adeptness of Latin American gangs to the internet, the use of the internet for messaging, for command and control, has been really quite significant. I'm wondering, from your perspective, apart from simply reflecting on how they've effectively become a third force in cyberspace that we haven't seen before, is again this really an issue of a mismatch between current policing powers and the nature of how internet enables these kinds of groups, or is it something more fundamental?
I want to react to that. I want to also react quickly to Misha as well, because and to Shauna's points about the purpose or intent. And I know Cal, I know your son, and I know that after the beheading that also occurred a couple of years ago, that there was, I remember his reaction as well, sort of a deep and profound sense of unease. And I agree that psychosis is one element. I think that part of that natural next step of the psychosis and about the trauma that's being inflicted is literally to create and segment, to create mental fortresses within our cities of London or Toronto or elsewhere, to not just create that sense of anxiety, unease, but to ultimately to separate that mosaic of communities, to distance people, to put people back into their homes, to seclude people, to create a more fertile space for those on either side to conform to more extremist ideologies and ideas that makes it more easy or more amenable to recruit ultimately within those spaces, and to further segment, and divide what are ostensibly, connect, that are potentially and/or were connected communities, and I think that's a really it's a very strategic move to create that. I mean, if you think about Baghdad, even in 2003, with the attack on Sergio de Mello, who at that time was the head of the UN in Baghdad, the intent wasn't just to send a message to the UN. and the international community. The intent was to get them out further behind their reinforced walls, to completely and totally separate them from the community. And then the intent was to separate Shiite and Sunni communities within Baghdad, specifically going after Shiites and ultimately creating that additional sense of extension, and then reinforcing those walls through systematic and sustained attacks, and therefore being able to recreate those kinds of fertile grounds for recruitment. So I think it's just important to understand it's not just about sending fear, but there's fear with purpose, and ultimately the purpose is to divide and then create more opportunity for recruitment. To get to this point about gangs, there has been, I don't know if it's been a surge, I've only been studying this for a couple of years, but there appears to be in parts of Latin America, from Mexico and Colombia through to Brazil and other parts of the region, a sense of gangs resorting to social media platforms and other forms of encrypted technologies to augment their capabilities. And they're doing this for a variety of reasons. One, gangs, unlike I would say many of these more underground jihadi type movements, are seeking to advertise, in many cases, their turf, their territory, to send signals to competing factions about who owns what, and to maintain control and dominance over particular networks or areas for distribution of cocaine or other forms of drugs. And so what we're seeing in certain kinds of gangs in parts of Mexico, definitely in El Salvador and Honduras, which are currently the most violent countries in the world if measured by homicide rates, and Brazil with certain large factions, is use of the internet to send messages and threats and to communicate, not just through alphanumeric sort of A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, but also through images and codes. And that's the first thing we're seeing. The second thing we're seeing, I think, is gangs also resorting to social media platforms as a means of augmenting their capability to sell product, be it drugs, be it sex work, be it other forms of illegal commodities. And Misha already alluded to that with some of the cartels adding this as an additional capability. A third we're seeing is, and we've done some studies on this, looking at through SecDev Foundation and with the NIJ and the Institute for Justice and University of San Diego in Southern California, is that we're also seeing gangs transmitting coded messages through social media platforms to literally organize their activities. It's very difficult to get the gang slang right because these codes will change. All languages change and they're dynamic and they evolve. Gang languages change very dramatically. And so it requires very, very deliberate and focused study to understand what kinds of messages are being transmitted. But we're seeing gangs now increasingly using both open media platforms like Twitter, but also closed media platforms like WhatsApp to communicate and augment their capability. I think we're just starting to get our heads around what's going on. I mean, the police in places like Rio or in Mexico City or in Bogota, where I'm more familiar, never mind Cape Town or Johannesburg or parts of Nairobi, are still using pin boards and sticking yellow, red, and blue pins where they've seen incidents to be able to understand the distribution of violence, let alone what's going on online in digital and cyberspace. So I think we have a big gap in terms of the speed at which organized crime groups and gangs in particular are resorting to these tools.
Yeah. Now, Shauna, this is obviously not an academic question for you. This is a very practical question, and maybe I'm going to phrase it in a different way and make a point. Can people actually get motivated for violence through the internet? Is this a catalyst for violence?
I think it depends on how much you drill down on motivation. So I compare the trajectory of what's happening online with terrorism to, for example, child exploitation or pedophilia was mentioned earlier, because I think the trajectories we've seen in that online community will eventually mirror itself as people become more organized around different types of crime. And so my point is, you don't go online unless you're looking for something, right? So you have to stumble across it. Someone has to introduce you to it somewhere, right? It's not like, it's just like, oh, look at this pop-up on my computer and it's telling me all about this great terrorist group I should join. Yeah. So, I mean, you're looking, you're searching for something. So there has to be an introduction, which means that there has to be some kind of an impetus that brought you there anyway, to take out and to seek out some type of engagement in that forum. And, I want to also just touch back on what you were talking about with respect to, looking at the evolution of what's happening online. And I can tell you from my own experience in Toronto that it's a continuum. So a lot of gangs we talk about is disorganized crime. They are, of course, in accordance with the criminal courts, seen as organized crime, but some of them are quite disorganized. But it's interesting because with the trajectory from disorganization to organization, you see a higher capacity of what happens online as well. And what's very impressive about some of these groups online, not just highly evolved organized crime, but also some of these terrorist groups, is they are quite sophisticated with respect to encryption, taking things that are in open source, social media dialogues, and then engaging people to a point where they move you into a space that is more automated or anonymous, like Kik or Telegram. So you do see a continuum, and it's very interesting to see how that's emerging in different places, sometimes quite surprising, particularly with respect to, when you get people engaged, for example, the millennial generation. I'm being very generic in what I'm talking about, but that sophistication is happening in a space where, others may not be able to catch up. So it's happening organically in different places, but along a continuum.
Just make one small observation just to add to that. I mean, we're seeing also groups, large, relatively organized groups, like the Gulf Cartel or the Sinaloa Cartel or the Zetas, for example, in Mexico, but also groups like the PCC in Brazil or even, I wouldn't necessarily call them an extremist group or a terrorist group, but the FARC or the ELN in Colombia, literally seeking out programmers, software engineers, data analysts to augment their capabilities. There's been a spate of kidnappings in Mexico over the last sort of 10 years, many of whom are software engineers and programmers, some of whom were associated with groups like the Anonymous group, the sort of hackers collective, who have been literally brought in to enhance that capability. So it goes back to Misha's idea that there is this very explicit and deliberate, I think, attempt to try to increase one's capability. The second point I want to mention, just about your point, Raphael, about does the internet itself as a means or as a medium, trigger, as opposed to aiding and abetting, resort to extremist-type violence. I think one of the things that's interesting about social media platforms in particular, which is where we're seeing a lot of this conversation taking place, is that it acts a bit like an echo chamber, doesn't it? It tends to reinforce communities, reinforce ideas, and reinforce like-minded ideas between specific communities. So if I am searching for that, that form of belonging that's been alluded to, I think, by all of us, and I think everyone, appreciates that if I'm looking to find that form of connectedness that I'm not finding in my neighborhood, that I somehow feel excluded from, and I find that community with whom I connect, my ideas and the ideas that are being sold to me are being reinforced constantly in that community in ways that you might not necessarily happen in accelerated form and in concentrated form in ways that we may not have had in the past.
There was a very good example of this the other day in Brussels when we had the, on Easter Monday, or was it Sunday? I think it was on Sunday, when people were just there, offering their prayers and their solidarity with the victims of the bombings. And suddenly, on the square descended a group of skinheads who were shouting the phrase "Belgium hooligans," and who actually went there in a show of aggression, presumably towards the jihadis, but actually it turned out to be a show of aggression towards other people who were there laying flowers and saying their prayers and so on. Now, that would have been organized online. It was actually organized both on Facebook and Twitter. It wasn't picked up by the Belgian police, who we know are under tremendous strain and who are disorganized in any event. But it's a very important signal as to what is going on in Europe. And I want to bring this back to Europe now, because here you are, frankly, in Canada. I come to Canada and I always breathe a huge sigh of relief, because it's not America, and it's very, very relaxing. And in Europe now, what we're seeing, one of the consequences of jihadi extremism, plus the migration crisis, which is monumental. You cannot believe what the atmosphere in Sweden or Germany, parts of Germany, is like at the moment. Plus the inability of the European Union to act coherently, to cooperate in response to these multiple social problems. We have a strong possibility that Marine Le Pen will be elected as President of France. We have a real possibility that the United Kingdom will leave the European Union, and this will have tremendously negative consequences on the rest of the European Union. We have Greece in a state of complete meltdown at the moment because of the euro crisis and because of the fact that they have 1 million refugees, more or less, in that country. We have a Turkey which is moving into a psychotic zone almost, and with whom Germany has to cooperate in order to get the migration crisis under control. And we have another crisis in Ukraine, and relations with Russia are at a particularly low ebb, and Libya is a hellhole. So, you know, for us, this is, yes, about extremism, but it is about an immense constellation of political crises, and we desperately need political leadership, a political leadership which unfortunately at the moment we don't have, and instead we're fracturing and fragmenting into national groups which are not capable of solving a problem that is this immense. So when you see things like Pegida going out onto the streets of Germany, when you hear of organizations like the Soldiers of Odin patrolling streets in Finland, I, as a Brit and as a European, I begin to feel very, very nervous about what is going on at the moment.
So Shauna, this is actually a good segue maybe to again a very practical problem. I mean, part of your job as a police officer working intelligence is really to forecast the risk factors that will bring people out onto the streets, extremist or not. In the last government, a lot of emphasis was put on increasing policing powers as a way of being able to be a bit more predictive about what the risk factors are, specifically when we get to the terrorist spectrum of extremism. But are surveillance powers really more justified or useful to addressing this problem? I mean, you seem to intimate the fact that social dislocation, understanding communities is equally important.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? I mean, we had a lot of protests in Toronto around Bill C-51, right? And am I going to tell you that surveillance powers for the police allow us to do more? Of course they do, right? But it's an ongoing dialogue about how far that should extend. What I personally believe is more powerful is the ability for communities to be strong and to have strong I'm looking for the sense of well-being in terms of social programs, an ability for you know, people who are having legitimate practical problems to be able to face those, to fill some of this void that we've been talking about today. And from a policing perspective, where we're putting a lot of our eggs in one basket is in the sense of working with communities on the issue of prevention, of being able to put people who are at risk into programs that will get them the assistance they need before we move further down the continuum into violence. The fact is that a lot of these things are happening in places where there may not be leakage to the state. So parents will see that there's a problem, friends will see that there's a problem, a teacher will see that there's a problem. They may or may not call the police. And no amount of surveillance is going to cover that. What those people need when they see those issues are practical places to go and programs to put those people into to make sure that that person doesn't follow down the continuum into extremism or gang violence or drug use or the myriad of things that people can fall into when they're suffering from social dislocation.
What about social media, though? If we understand, or if we take as a given Misha's argument that, you know, the internet is an echo chamber, that people will find meaning in these spaces, how important is it for the police force to become involved in community security, but in cyberspace and social media? I mean, it's a hot potato, but clearly there seems to be some pressure and some merit in this activity.
So when I talk about communities, I don't just mean in real life. I also mean online. So, you know, there are opportunities to move for intervention online as well. Like, it's very, whenever I'm talking about things in real life, I also mean online. And I say that because in Toronto, what we're really moving to do, and we haven't gotten there yet, but we're trying to get further along the continuum all the time, is to run investigations or community engagement in a way that is both online and in real life at the same time. Because you hit in different places, in different spaces. So whether it's a neighborhood officer talking to a teacher who says, hey, I have a problem with the student, can you help? Whether it's someone reaching out online, and we have this all the time, people reaching out online, hey, I'm worried about so-and-so, check out what they posted, and we'll go look at it. Sometimes it's somebody who's suicidal, sometimes it's someone who's got, you know, an ideology that has them talking about going and harming someone tomorrow in a political way, in a religious way, whatever it is. We've had examples of all of those things. But it is important for us to engage with communities in a preventative way where wherever we can.
Now, Rob, you and I have done quite a bit of work in the past on preventing armed violence and looking at risk factors among communities in real life. How much of that do you think actually translates into cyberspace? I mean, where are there legitimate risk factors that we can look for that can be addressed, or are we looking at too much of a reification of real life to really have that have the same amount of traction?
Boy, that's a complicated question.
I'm glad it was at you.
Yeah, and you run intelligence for the Toronto Police. That's a real. I mean, I think let me start from maybe what I know a little bit of, and it's about the way organized violence concentrates spatially, temporally, and demographically. And I think it's probably no surprise to anyone, but it's useful to repeat that the vast majority of violence concentrates in a very, very small geographic area. In any given city, be it Toronto, Ottawa, be it Bogota, Rio, be it Aleppo and Damascus, you tend to have about 80+% of the lethal violence concentrated in less than 1% of the street corners in a given city. That's the first point. So when we talk about these phenomena of extremist violence or conflict or crime, we need to be very conscious about how it concentrates spatially. The second point is it tends to concentrate temporally. You often see it happen at certain times of the week, of the day, of the month, et cetera. And I think we got to get a lot smarter. If you look at the average 160+ hours in a week, you tend to have about 4 or 5 of those hours being peak periods where we got to be a lot more serious if we want to get smarter about solutions. Third thing is demographically. If you think about hot spots and hot times, well, we can say, and I have to be careful here, but hot people. There are specific kinds of characteristics for people. I'm talking about young men in particular. I'm talking about 19 to 24. I'm talking about people who tend to be lacking opportunity. People come from broken families. The single most effective, by the way, prevention strategy you can have to reduce violence in any given community is focusing on early parenting strategies, dealing with that social disorganization of the family, providing alternatives for single-headed female households to give kids a chance for education. Dollar for dollar, pound for pound, that is where you should be putting your money. So again, being very focused about the space, the time, the demographics of how this concentrates, I think applies to a large extent IRL, in real life, but I think it probably also applies in many ways to the virtual world as well.
But there's a huge privacy issue here as well, given the fact that what you're really talking about is more effective profiling. That with public health surveillance, at least you're dealing with a little bit of a stopgap method. There's an anonymization of data that allows you to look for clusters and identify them without getting personal. Cyberspace is hugely personal. I think the recent case of Apple versus the FBI kind of brought that to the forefront, to the extent where maybe a legitimate problem risks opening up or reopening the social contract between individuals and their states in a way that really threatens the very essence of.
But it's not just it's not just Apple. It's Google, it's Twitter, it's Facebook. All of these major companies right now are struggling with this very specific issue. The FBI case in San Bernardino, I think, brings it to light for North America. But right now in Brazil, we have executives from Google and WhatsApp, Facebook, who've been chucked in jail for not giving over ostensibly private data for cases involving organized crime because A, they say they can't give over encrypted data in the case of WhatsApp, or B, because they're taking a principled stand and saying we're not going to give you personal information. So I think all these big companies right now are struggling with it. In the last, I would say, 12 to 13 months, Twitter's taken down 125,000 Twitter handles of so-called jihadi terrorists. Again, very controversial. Google's introduced now a new program which tries to have alternate messages, positive messages whenever you type in negative extremist type nomenclature. It will then literally post up positive messages from organizations that are promoting counter-narratives or de-radicalization. That's their strategy. As well as very focused programs on extremists. Facebook right now and Twitter are trying to take down as fast as it goes up, extremist and violent narratives. They've now augmented their capability by a couple of hundred people to be able to respond rapidly, in that real-time way. But again, it raises a whole bunch of questions, especially when we have this broad bandwidth of what constitutes an extremist or terrorist act. And I think it's a very tricky line. Right now, I think tech companies are trying to sort out where that line is. But
this
Misha.
is also a question of scale. I mean, we've had these issues of privacy and state intervention with letters. We've had it with telegraph. We've had it with telephone as well. The reason why the internet is so important is that everyone accesses the internet all the time and is giving out information all the time. And so the scale has taken us into a different into a different zone, if you like. A lot of the time, none of this really matters. We have what's called the online disinhibition effect, whereby for some reason, when people are talking on the internet, they feel as though they can be much more unpleasant and much more violent in their opinions than they would be if they were talking face to face. Anyone who's written an article in a newspaper and then had to suffer reading the comments below understands what this is. Now, that's all fine, except, of course, it does reinforce positions, as Rob alluded to. When it becomes critical is when you have a greater problem in society. So if you look at Brazil now, for example, the polarization of the two sides in Brazil has been very rapid and very quick, and the internet and social media is driving a great deal of this. We can see it in the United States, and here it has had a really disruptive impact on what we regarded as relatively stable, predictable politics of GOP and the Democrats. The GOP are in complete meltdown, in part because the rank and file Republican voters are suddenly feeling empowered about what they can do against the GOP establishment, which I don't think we've ever seen before to this extent. So suddenly it becomes important when you have a crisis. Rest of the time, do we care about it that much? No, we don't.
But it is a problem, and it is a challenge for example, for police forces, because as much as we like to see cyberspace as being a public space, it's actually not.
No.
It's a private space, which is largely staked out by corporations.
Look, all communications have always been regulated. The problem is that there is a big problem with the internet because it emerged as a libertarian tool as well as a military tool. You had, two strands of the internet emerging, and that libertarian sense was very powerful amongst an early community, and you can still feel it. And you can also be concerned about the state's arrogation of certain rights to itself when it comes to policing the internet. And so this balance is very, very important. We know that Russia monitors more or less everything that goes on the Russian internet. We know that the Chinese do it. We know that the NSA has been doing it as well. For me, it's quite simple, is that you have to have independent judicial oversight over these powers. And if you don't have that, then any police officer worth their salt is likely to be tempted at some point to overstep the mark, unless they know that there are institutions that will hold you accountable.
As a police officer, Shauna wants to...
I totally agree with what you're saying. One of the interesting things, though, to factor into that is one of the reasons I think that the judiciary hasn't caught up with it is that judges tend to be of a certain generation. And I've had my officers testify in court and we're about to get into, the fire hose and how the fire hose works and how we're, bringing stuff from Twitter and the judge will say, okay, real life story. Okay, sorry, can you go back and tell me what's a tweet? What is that? And I thought, oh my God, we're going to be here forever. So it's very challenging when you're dealing with generational issues like that. So it is a little bit of the Wild West, and I think it'll take some time until the judiciary catches up to build in those regulations.
That's right, but that is a temporary issue. Because,
it is a temporary issue.
Because the generations are coming up who understand the internet instinctively. But I agree. I've been in courts when this has happened, and
But the one thing I did want to say though is there are concepts though that I think are important that are out there that haven't been implemented yet. And one of the most interesting concepts that I've done research on is this issue of public privacy. The idea, because this has come up in other court cases historically, it hasn't been used with respect to the internet, but it's been used with respect to things like putting GPS devices into cars. So the idea that literally you can be on the subway, you can go to a baseball game, you can be going about your business, and you have the assurance that the state is not following you unless there is specific grounds to be doing so. So it's interesting because we're looking at these concepts and then we're trying to implement them, bearing in mind Section 8 issues and hoping that when we bring them to the judiciary, that the framework that we have used will in fact be then adopted by the judiciary. But we're kind of figuring it out as we go along, which is really exciting and interesting in some ways and a little bit scary in others because we don't want to get it wrong. But you're right. I mean, we absolutely do need that.
I think there's also a matter of practicality, though, and in that cyberspace is a private space and not just a public space. You know, you're forced to make a decision as a public law enforcement institution. Do you deputize companies to be able to do some of the policing on your behalf, as has been done in the States with Obama's appeal to Silicon Valley to cooperate in countering violent extremism? Or do you attempt to do it yourself, recognizing the resources that you have, the people, the technology, will always put you 2 steps behind the clever young 20-year-olds who are able to leverage a global infrastructure and networking to circumvent you? I mean, how do you deal with that challenge?
Well, I think right now they're separate and distinct. I think over time you are going to see more collaboration between the two. I mean, there's just, police budgets aren't capable of keeping up in the same way that corporate entities are. And some of it may in fact be things like, whether it's machine learning or data mining or any of these things, that the bigger picture, rather than about individuals, but patterns, that I think those opportunities you'll see leveraged first. For example, Google did a study where they asked spouses about, what do you want for Christmas? And then when, Google identified through their algorithm what they wanted for Christmas, and they got it right more often than the spouse. I'd love to have that kind of technology at my fingertips to be able to identify, who I should be concerned about out there. It's not happening yet, but I do think those types of collaborations will grow, particularly as we see that, the state is just not capable of keeping up with what's going on out there.
Yeah, and on the strength of algorithms, just as a funny aside, I had a colleague who signed up to a dating site, and unbeknownst to him was actually matched up with his sister who had signed up for the same site at the same time.
Doesn't always get it right.
Or it gets it totally right. That's awesome.
Totally right. Yeah.
Just briefly on the algorithm thing as well. The algorithm haven't worked out about authors yet, because what authors do is obsessively check on Amazon where their book is on the ranking. So all I'm ever advertised is my own book, because Google knows that I'm obsessively trying to decide whether I want to buy it or not.
Yeah, and as a natural segue to our next question, which is self-interest, we recognize that violent extremism is an issue, but it's not just a Canadian issue, it's a global issue. So maybe as a way of segueing to questions from the audience, I can canvass you for some of your own reflections. What should Canada be doing about the issue of violent extremism? Both domestically, in terms of potentially looking at ways to do it better, coordination between public, private, discussion perhaps among Canadians about the transformative aspects of cyberspace and how it impacts on this question. But more importantly, what should we be doing about it globally, recognizing that in Europe and the Middle East and Latin America, these are issues which are bringing insecurity to our borders and not simply over there and out of mind. Shauna, maybe you want to kick us off?
That's an easy one. No, I think collaboration is really important. One of the things that I see in law enforcement, and it doesn't matter whether you're municipal, provincial, federal, our opportunities for information sharing are limited. And that's a challenge. You look at the issues that are happening in Europe right now, and you think about every one of those cities and towns having a different police agency in charge. So, cyberspace is not jurisdictional, but we're still operating under old policing models that are around physical space, and it just doesn't fit. And the only way around that is to build a new model, and particularly with respect to cyberspace, to really integrate ways of collaboration and information sharing. I can tell you that in the child exploitation world, this has been done really well. It took a long time to get there, but it was done really well. We have not caught up to it with respect to this issue, and I think that's the trajectory that we need to go.
Yeah.
Rob, and just before you start,
Sure.
we were going to take questions from the floor, so I would encourage any of you with a question or a comment to start lining up between the 2 conveniently located microphones that we have in the center of the room, and we'll proceed to that just after this round of questions. Rob.
No, I mean, I think globally, we need to be really cognizant again of this sort of hotspot question. I mean, there are really 5 or 6 countries. I mean, terrorist acts, again, inverted commas, probably occurred in about 70 or 80 countries last year, but there are really 5 or 6 that account for the vast majority of what's driving it, both domestically in those countries, but also what's driving this kind of sentiment, this kind of grievances around the world, including in parts of Western Europe and North America. Canada has a long and venerable tradition, I think, of conflict prevention, of promoting peace support abroad, of peacekeeping. I know that the current administration wants to get back in the peacekeeping game in a bigger way than the previous one. And I think this is a really important signal that Canada can send. And more importantly, there's sort of concrete actions that Canada can take to support partners in trying to bring, it's going to sound naive and hopeful, but we have to be, peace in a number of these places where we're seeing the concentrations of violence, number one. So getting back in the game, playing a constructive role in mediation, in prevention, early diplomacy, these are things that Canada did very well in the past, and I think we're glad to have Canada back, and the world is desperately glad to have Canada back in the UN and elsewhere. I think the second area is around cities. Canada has actually, we've had a long history of terrorism in Canada going back to the 1920s. In the 1960s, we had the FLQ. In the 70s and 80s, we had Armenian Turk. In the 80s, we had Sikhs. In the 90s, we had, now we're into jihadi, so-called terrorism, Wahhabi, kind of Salafi type terrorism. So this is something, but Canadian cities in particular, and Canadians in general, I think have done a remarkable job at dealing with these issues intelligently, rationally, on the basis of good evidence, in a sophisticated, mature, and I think very careful and cautious way. If you consider that a lot of the acts that we're seeing today are coming from second, third, fourth generation immigrant community, immigrant families, and, Canada has an experience of dealing with these multiple generations of immigrant communities in a way that I think is appropriate, responsible, and careful in building resilience in cities. These are really important lessons I think Canada needs to double down on, but also can export. Mayors are incredibly practical people. And cities are where a lot of these kinds of challenges are starting to accumulate. And I think working with mayors in particular, the hundreds and hundreds of mayors that are dealing with these problems on a day-to-day basis and helping reinforce and identify and replicate positive strategies is something that Canada can do through the council, our Federation of Mayors here in Canada, but also through other kinds of mayoral networks. The one thing I think we'll say is that Canada has it's the rebalancing of the approach away from, I think, not away, complementing the law enforcement approach and sort of focused deterrence, which is, and hotspot type policing, which I think has a demonstrable and statistically important impact on reducing organized violence, to an approach that also emphasizes resilience building, strengthening communities, increasing natural surveillance, eyes in the street, improving the law enforcement relationship with communities. That's fundamental to any kind of meaningful engagement. So I think the rebalancing that Canada is now pursuing in the current budget suggests is the direction that Canada will be taking, I think is very important. So a rebalancing, I think, is also a really important strategy for Canada.
Misha, you've peered deep into the soul of men and what has motivated them. Is Rob naive, or is there hope to be found here?
Well, I think there is hope to be found in Canada. I mean, really, I come here extremely distressed about our own situation in Europe, and I repeat, it is a relief to come here. But there are some lessons where we are doing things quite well. One of the things that happened in Britain, of course, is we had the Irish conflict. Now, the British state played an occasionally despicable role during the Troubles, as we called them, but it also had some positive lessons to be learnt from that, not least in how you go about conflict resolution. But one of the positive things for the UK was that we understood how you get effective intelligence up and running in difficult situations. And one reason why we are less threatened by terrorism at the moment is because British intelligence is well integrated into minority communities. So I was speaking to a Somali cab driver going to the airport the other day, and I said to him, where is radicalization taking place in the United Kingdom? I said, is it taking place? By the way, next to Shepherd's Bush Police Station is Shepherd's Bush Mosque. I said, is it taking place in places like Shepherd's Bush Mosque? He said, the mosques. He said, no, there's no radicalization going on there. I said, why is that? And he said, because MI5 is all over the place. Nobody would dare say anything radical in a mosque. And so on some things we've got right, but some things we've got really wrong. We have never had anything like the amount of minority people in police forces in our country. It is still an overwhelmingly white police force. And this is something which I think Canada does a little better, but it can do much better on still, because that is a really important interface of the state with the local communities, is the actual police force, so that if you have members of the police coming from that community, then you will have the best early warning system you possibly could about things possibly going wrong in that community. And I know it's not on the horizon, but do stick to your gun laws as you have them now. I note as a final statistic that last year, more people were killed in the United States by toddlers playing with their family guns than by terrorists. So when you hear Trump, Cruz, etc., rattle on about terrorism and so on and so forth, just pause and thank the Lord that you're north of the 39th parallel.
Thank you, Misha. And I'll go to the questions at the second microphone, please.
Yes, thanks very much to the panel. It's been very, very enlightening. I've enjoyed it. Two questions. The first one is to the entire panel, and it's about the criminal terrorist nexus. And the Washington Post just this week carried an article about the Belgian attackers, all of whom had criminal records. So I'm just wondering if that should, if indeed is an nexus, is it something that police and security agencies should concentrate further? Is it a sign that terrorists will graduate, or criminals will graduate into the terrorists? The second one is mostly to Misha, but I'd invite all the panelists to comment, and it's about Europe and the Pan-European Police and Security Cooperation. It's been going on for 30 years. They have Europol. But one weak link and the system falls apart, and I couldn't help but think of Robert's comments about less developed police agencies in less developed countries using actually pins to track terrorists. And was this the case in Belgium? Are there other is that the state of the Belgian security agencies' professionalism? And are there any other weak links there? So appreciate your comments.
Rob, you were looking anxious on the first question.
That's just my natural state. Just great questions. And I think on the criminal sort of extremist nexus, absolutely, I think there needs to be some, if there's any conclusion from this panel, I think that a greater cooperation between intelligence and policing, obviously needs to take place. A greater coordination, a greater sharing of information. These are all maybe naive and hopeful, but I think essential. But I think one area that I think the Post and others of the Washington Post and others have been pointing to is around the prison systems and the penal systems and the jails and prisons, where a lot of this radicalization increasingly is being seen to be occurring. And this comes as no surprise for anyone who studies criminology or spends a lot of time working on gangs. We call prisons in Brazil crime colleges. In Belgium, I think a lot of the discussion around the 11 big prisons and about the relationship between Molenbeek and the people who've been involved in the Paris and the Brussels attacks and the prison systems have been made clearer and clearer. What often happens is that people are brought into the prison system and are very easily susceptible to a radicalization process in those prisons from would-be past extremists, and often find that their view, talk about echo chamber, the perceived injustices either of the state acting malignly towards them or of the injustices taking place in Iraq or Syria or Afghanistan or Pakistan become, let's call it, urgent and present and constant on their minds. And so if you don't go into prison as a committed extremist, then you certainly have a much higher probability and likelihood of coming out of prison as one. And the same applies for gangs and organized crime. If many young sort of small-scale drug traffickers caught with a couple of grams of marijuana in most cities across Latin America will go into prison, and to survive in that prison, one has to align oneself to a particular group. And to ensure the well-being of your family. While you were in prison, one has to align oneself with that group. And to pay allegiance and pay the dues for having done all that, when you leave prison, you must maintain your affiliation with that gang. And so it reproduces and recreates and strengthens the bonds. And so if we don't get our prison systems right, if we don't understand that you need more than just the 6 imams that they have for the entire imam chaplains for the entire Belgian prison system, if we don't double, triple, quadruple the numbers to be able to get our intelligence right in prisons, but also to be able to deal with some of those issues in the prisons, and I'm not a person who specializes in the penal system by any stretch, and I think we're missing a huge part of the problem.
Just on the prisons, prisons are a real problem in the United Kingdom, and we lock up far too many people. After the United States, we have the highest per capita prison population in the developed world. This is something that we have to revise. We now have the phenomenon in the United Kingdom where radicalizers are taking over whole wings of the prison, and even the prison staff are becoming intimidated and scared about intervening with their activities. And in the UK, a lot of radicalized jihadis have come straight out of the prison system. In France, Britain, and Belgium, it is on the whole petty crime. It is small amounts of drug dealing, it's theft, and so on and so forth. It's not big organized crime, and they are then radicalized in prison. And this is of deep concern to many people in Europe. On the question of pan-European law enforcement, Europol has very few powers. It is merely a coordinator of data, and the use of that data or the passing on of that data from one law enforcement agency to another is determined by the country itself. So it's a very weak organization. However, under its present director, Rob Wainwright, they have established a cybercrime unit which sort of through the back door actually has an operational capacity. And this is the first time that we have a pan-European policing organization with operational capacity, and it is in the sector where we need it most. So I think there is an understanding, and the attacks in Brussels and France is undoubtedly underlining this, that we have to be much more engaged in our cooperation between police forces.
Okay. Just to note, there may be 50 ways to leave your lover, but there's about 10 minutes to dinner. So I'm going to ask, I'm going to ask the people at the microphone if you could try to make your questions as quick as possible, and I'd also ask the panelists to let's do some snappy. So we'll take a few questions and then solicit more collective answers from our panelists. Sir.
Between 2010 and 2014, Canada resettled 14,000 Iraqi refugees. And now about 7,000 of them live in Windsor, many of them still on welfare and cursing the infidels. So are the police and intelligence communities aware of the potential for small communities like this to be fertile grounds? And what political steps can be taken by the national or provincial government or municipal governments to get people to engage, to avoid isolation, self-isolation, to avoid these communities becoming an incubus for radicalization?
Thank you. We'll take a question on the rear microphone as well.
First of all, Mr. Glenny, if I don't thank you for McMafia, my wife will kill me. It reflected, she's African, and it reflected her experience of Lagos precisely. Thank you. Mr. Muggah, in the time I spent in Dharavi, which is a pretty miserable place, it became very clear to me that everybody living there could go home, but they didn't. And for a very simple reason. They were worse off in the villages. And that's important to remember when we look at these slums. Now, I imagine that these conditions are different in different countries. I imagine that phenomena of urbanization in Latin America is very different from India, where you've got caste. That makes a difference in our analysis, both in terms of crime, and which I think is a separate issue, that of jihadist terrorism. In your discussion of the three of you, no one mentioned racism, which is a serious problem. No one mentioned anti-Muslim attitudes, of which there are, even in this country. What I'm saying is that the analysis has to go further, has to go deeper. And finally, in political terms, is the issue of hypocrisy. When I was in Zagreb, I would meet with the former prime minister and people from various political parties. And after the pictures of Abu Ghraib came out, I was there to get a hold of General Gotovina. The former prime minister showed me the picture of the guy who looked like a Christmas tree and said, after this, why should we give anyone up? And that is a serious issue. We've just had a Senate report on torture, and not a single person has been charged. Now that makes a difference for youth who are very much concerned with morals and justice. Thank you.
And we'll take one more question at the front microphone, please.
I wanted to thank you very much for the presentation. It was great. My question, which I will make quick, is that there has been a lot of talk, and as there always is, and as there should be, about the marginalized communities, the attendant racism, lack of employment, more difficult to get employment, obviously, in these marginalized communities. But that is not the only place where extremism comes from, if we're talking specifically about Islamic extremism at the moment. Just as much of it comes from a very well-adapted middle class. University of London, Queen Mary just did recently a big study, and they found that being part of the middle class and on the upper echelons, it was in fact a risk factor. We have, a good half of people, even from France, who go to join IS, and they do come from a very well-adapted middle class, just as much as, the gangster jihadis, as Mubin Sheikh has it, are also attracted to that, but for different reasons. But we hear a lot about that first group, as we did today, but we very seldom hear anything about the other.
Okay, thank you very much for your question. And maybe let's go in order. Shauna, if you want to take on the first question of Windsor.
Oh, you want me? Okay, I was going to go with the last one. Okay. So I would say to you that, it's not just municipal police services that are looking at this. Also, the province is involved, as are the RCMP. So you have to remember that, when there are things happening in particular communities, it's not just Windsor Police that would be involved. It would also be, the provincial anti-terrorism section, as well as INSET. So they have cross-jurisdictional investigations that they do, so they're aware well of where things are occurring, in one city versus another. As was brought up in the last question, London has had its share of challenges as well. So certainly it's an issue that is alive and aware.
Rob, on the issue of risk factors.
Well, there are a couple of great questions, and just to take them very quickly, because I think we'd like to get some more questions. But the first, in the refugee question. There is a dangerous temptation right now, and certainly in Europe, it's even more acute just by virtue of this extraordinary explosion of refugees. And by the way, which is just the beginning, I think, of what's going to be a longer, even more sustained movement of blaming the refugee. And this is certainly also driving a very dangerous xenophobic rhetoric in the States, and as I think as our colleagues mentioned who spoke, a latent kind of racism, perhaps even here in Canada. I think it's very important to emphasize that refugee populations compose a minuscule, almost statistically irrelevant proportion of the acts that have currently been successfully committed in parts of Europe, and certainly that have been attempted here. I think in the less than you can count on one hand in the States for the last 15, 20 years, there have been refugee-related populations, asylum claimants, Why? Because these are amongst the most heavily screened immigrants coming into the country. There is a relatively sophisticated infrastructure around supporting and helping resettle these populations. And I think one has to be very careful about drawing the line around refugee populations. They often represent the most sophisticated and, I would say, adventurous and robust and resilient of their populations to have had the capability of even getting to Canada in the first place. So I think one has to be kind of careful, and I suspect I can't speak to the detail of operationally, tactically, of how those populations are being addressed. It is interesting to note, though, that when we talk about this question of racism in the States, in Canada, and this sort of stigmatization of the Muslim population, an interesting survey was done last year of over 450 police departments in the United States to canvass them about what they considered to be the greatest risk when it came to extremist violence. The vast majority, 75%, said it was not Islamic or jihadi related extremist violence. It was right-wing, homegrown extremist violence that was constituting the most egregious threat. And I think that, of course, there were a small number of police departments in Manhattan or in Los Angeles and elsewhere that said, no, this is really a big issue for us. The vast majority of the threats were local, homegrown. And I think that's also something important to keep in mind, which is it's similar. There's a lot of this going on in Europe, and Misha rightly addressed the issues that are happening in Finland, Norway, Sweden, as well as in the UK in terms of right-wing, the return, in a way, the resurgence of extremist kind of right-wing populist kind of extremist violence. But I think the issue here in North America is much more about homegrown, I think, in many ways. And I think, I'm sure colleagues in Toronto can refer to that. The final point about the slums, and I really take that point, living myself not 100 meters away from one of the largest slums, or 500 meters away from one of the largest slums in Latin America, or favelas, we call them in Brazil. Informal communities, we call them academically. I completely agree that slums, one cannot brush, broad brush them as areas of housing and fostering, enabling extremist violence. There are many slums that are much safer than the sort of more ostensibly middle class or even elite areas. Slums themselves and favelas and informal settlements are highly heterogeneous. And so I don't think we should be very careful. However, the one thing I would say, just going back to Misha and Shauna's original points when we started this conversation, they by definition represent areas where the state has comparatively limited purchase. They by definition represent areas where services are often ad hoc or remarkably ingenious in their ad hocness, but still ad hoc. They represent areas of acute concentrated rates of high informal unemployment and formal unemployment. They represent areas where you have high concentrations of young men in particular who often are the front line when moving from the village into the city. They often represent areas where you look for alternate forms of belonging, and in an era of the internet and of where everyone's got a mobile phone, virtually everyone, the digital divide is completely being eviscerated in many of these low-income areas, where everyone can see what they do not have in ways that they couldn't in the past. It's no longer functioning as the reserve labor. They are very much part and central to the international markets and commodity chains. They understand that they are, and I think, I'm not suggesting that we stigmatize these areas or that we throw police, far from it. I think we have to get to terms with this new reality, and that the Karachis of the world are the new normal. They're not the exception. No, we can sit in Canada, and I think, quite as Misha say, feel relaxed and easy and comfortable being here. I feel less so than he does, given reading the Globe and Mail. More like the National Post. But I do think we need, my concerns, I guess, at the meta scale are what's happening outside of Canada. And I think it will affect Canada if we don't get our heads around it. Sorry.
Let me take 3 final questions, and then we'll wrap up. Front microphone, please.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much for this talk. It's been really riveting. Basically, what you guys talked about is essentially the negligent states, the social exclusion, the lack of opportunity. In all of this, in the hour and a half that I was sitting here, I have not heard anything about, the religion that's driving this, Islam or Muslims, right? To me, I think there's a huge difference between anti-Muslim bigotry and Islamophobia, which I think is just invented to, shut down the debate. Now, to speak to Misha, you talked about Pegida and the rise of the nationalist parties such as the Geert Wilders in Netherlands or Marine Le Pen in France. Now, when you have the likes of Anjem Chowdhury running around and openly saying what they want to do, are you surprised that such a thing might be occurring in Europe?
Do you want me to answer that, or should we?
Let me take the last two questions, and then we'll go on to Phil.
Thank you. Philip Berry, Old Soldier. We've been talking about organic events, about individuals, about people being self-radicalized or radicalized by outreach through typically the internet or through the prisons, which are crime colleges here in this country too. And then, Rafael, you brought up the question of what should Canada do, and then Rob picked it up and talked about peacekeeping, and suddenly we're talking about sovereign states on the international stage. And so my question, which probably isn't very coherent, is then how do we translate all the stuff that we've been discussing for the last little while into the actions of the sovereign agents on the international stage? Do the same things happen at that level? And are those actors, those sovereign states, are they actors in this organic ferment of internet and social media and slum and prison activity? And are the aims of international actors being pursued through those channels, just as the aims of jihadis and the KKK are being pursued?
Thanks, Phil. Sir?
Sure.
Final question.
Sure. Thank you. I found the presentations very, very reassuring. Like the gentleman who just spoke at the first mic, I too noticed that religion was not part of the discussion, that the reasons that we're seeing these terrorist attacks have to do with its hyper inequality, its the youth bulge, men with no horizons, opportunities, a speed of urban growth. These are very Western ways of looking at issues. We tend to say, oh, these are very familiar to us. That's what Western intellectuals such as yourself do when you see something, well, it's economic inequality. And religion is such a tough nut to crack and deal with. We're in a much more of a comfort zone when we can talk about income inequality, wealth distribution. But I'm concerned that this is the way the Marxists used to say to people who who had their attachments to ethnicity, a flag, national, said, no, you're a victim of false consciousness. We know your mind better than you do. You should be, if you really understood things, it would be class. That's if you were really smart about it. So despite all the religious imagery on jihadi websites and the appeal to religion and saying you are a true believer if you do this, what we're saying to these people is, we know your mind better than you do. And is there a danger that we could get that wrong? Thank you.
Let's go in reverse order. Misha.
So I started talking initially about Yugoslavia. And I did that for a reason, because in Yugoslavia I saw two relatively powerful Christian states, or embryonic states, using their power frequently to inflict violence on Christians, but on Muslims as well. So first of all, I don't want people to develop the idea that a particular religion has a monopoly on mass violence, because it doesn't, and I've seen it in my lifetime. The other thing that I observed in Yugoslavia on all sides, and this includes Muslims in Bosnia and Muslims in Kosovo as well, was the readiness to instrumentalize religion in order to mobilize people behind a flag, but that flag was not merely a piece of cloth waving in the wind. People had motivation for doing this. I really think that what Yugoslavia was about, and you can call me a neo-Marxist if you like, was about small groups of the elite, including criminal gangs, in Serbia and Croatia in particular, but it happened in Kosovo and Bosnia as well, seizing hold of previously state assets and privatizing them and making them very rich in the process. And that, for me, was the outcome of Yugoslavia in terms of who were the winners, who were the losers. Ordinary people who were frightened into seeing their religion as the primary marker. And so I think we have to be a bit careful about denouncing a particular type of Islamic identity as being representative of whole communities. Having said that, I'd like to go back to the questioner who talked about hypocrisy. And of course, if we look at this in a sort of in a more global sense, we have real responsibility in the West. We cannot look away from the impact of Iraq. In the United Kingdom and France, we cannot look away at the impact of Libya and what this has done. We cannot understand what's happening in Syria until we fully understand what was going on in the Arab Spring, which I don't think we know. We cannot understand jihadi violence without looking at the relationship between the West and Saudi Arabia and what we have allowed Saudi Arabia to do in terms of radicalization, whilst continuing to sell them weapons and to buy their oil. If you look at the transformation of Pakistan, much of that has been funded by Saudi money, and much of that Saudi money has initially come from us because we're buying their oil and we're selling them weapons. And so, you know, jihadi violence was not terribly present in the 1930s. Jihadi violence was not terribly present in the 1950s. There must be reasons why it is as present as it is now. And finally, I'll sign off by just saying one thing about the absorption of refugees. In 1972, in a 6-month period, the United Kingdom took in 90,000 Ugandan Asians, 90,000, many of whom, incidentally, are Muslims, and who are one of the most successful communities in the United Kingdom. David Cameron has magnanimously said that we will take 40,000 Syrians by 2020 as refugees. The European Union, with 500 million people, is theoretically perfectly capable of absorbing 1, 2, 3 million Syrian refugees. But for political reasons, and because we are living through an age of austerity as a consequence of 2008, that is not politically sellable at the moment. And so I think when we look at this, we have to look at the global, the more global factors, as well as looking at individual issues relating to each country.
Rob, 60 seconds or less.
Misha has, as usual, expertly channeled much of what I would think and feel in a much more elegant way than I ever could express it. So I simply would underline what Misha said. The only other observation I'd mention perhaps is, you know, I think in ISIS and in Al-Qaeda and others right now in Europe, I think what we're facing is not a set of isolated events necessarily, or a set of sporadic events nurtured, enabled in prison systems or in low, marginal communities. I think those are the incubators and facilitators. I think what we are seeing right now is a pretty sustained campaign. And I think that we've yet, in Europe, especially in Europe, to get our heads around what in fact is going on. What we are seeing, I think, is a highly networked, irregular, hybrid, and widely distributed campaign, which I think will require all of what the intelligence services and law enforcement capabilities have to offer to get their heads around. And so I think it's very important that we get our heads around that. It's different than I think what we're seeing in parts of North America and Canada. And it's very different than what we're seeing in parts of Lahore or Islamabad or Karachi or Mogadishu. And so we have to understand the heterogeneity of what we're facing. But I think in Europe we see something quite profound. And it is linked, I think, as Misha said, to these causal factors, which are these 5 or 6 simmering conflicts that we have to deal with. The only final thing I'd say, just in response to one of the questions about are the international systems, as it were, because there are systems and agencies and institutions capable of and or responding effectively to this threat, and I think the answer is no, right now. The UN has launched a series of reviews of its peacekeeping operations, of its peace-building operations, of its counter-extremist agendas. These have been ongoing for the last 2 years. All of the reviews were announced this past year. There has been an effort to set up funds within the United Nations systems. There is a notion of subsidiarity, of trying to get regional organizations much more engaged on these issues to deal with local problems, regionally. But right now, what we're seeing, I think, is that these institutions are just inadequate right now, as they're currently constructed and as they're currently organized, to address the challenges we're facing. So I am somewhat less optimistic about the so-called international system to be able to engage effectively.
Shauna.
I'm just going to talk about the Toronto experience very quickly, because I think, it's only when I come to public forums that people say, okay, well, can we talk about Islam and whether or not that's, obviously playing a role. That's a very niche type of extremism. And in Toronto, I can tell you that statistically, the problems have not been with extremism with respect to anything associated to Daesh or ISIS or whatever you want to call it. And in fact, some of our biggest challenges have been with like neo-Nazi, anti-state organizations like Freemen on the Land, looking at some of the environmental groups. When we launched our Countering Violent Extremism program in Toronto, I can tell you that the first candidate to go into it was not of any kind of religious affiliation. It was one of the other groups that I mentioned. And so it's really important not to just focus. If we had a Countering Violent Extremism conference today that was specific to the issue at hand with respect to what's happening in Europe, I would say I'd probably not be the best person to be up here speaking about it. And I think it's really important to understand that, because statistics aren't released on this, so people, I think, by what they see in virtue of papers and what's happening in Europe and online, that they think that the issue is isolated to a particular area. I can tell you that while statistically our challenges are in various communities and other forms of extremism, and I'm not saying that does not include Islamic extremism, because it does, that's one portion of it, but that statistically what we have seen is a rise in hate crimes, and that started right after the Paris attacks. So I think it's really important to be putting those two things in context. Certainly from my perspective, the second one alarms me more, because I do think that out there in our communities that there is a sense that there is a community to blame, and statistically that just doesn't play out at all, currently in Toronto anyway. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you very much. And perhaps on that note, I'm reminded by the question that was put on the role of religion by the words of Khalil Gibran, which were artfully used by Robert Fisk, writing about the Lebanon conflict. Pity the nation where sects abound, but no religion is to be found. And on that, I would like to thank my panelists very much. Shauna Coxton, Robert Muggah, Misha Glenny. I'd like to say that for them, coming to Ottawa in March was a real stimulating experience, but realistically I actually had something deep and dark on each and every one of them to convince them to come. I'd like to thank very much CIC for helping organize this evening's event. And I'd also like to extend my thanks to Brett Kubicek from Public Safety Canada. Brett, are you here somewhere in the audience? If you could just stand up for a second. So Brett has been the manager of Public Safety Canada's Kanishka program, which has been the only program run by the Canadian government over the last 5 years that has really made it possible for these kinds of venue and research into terrorism and the causes of terrorism to really come to the fore. He's just winding up 5 years of managing the program, and I'd like to thank him very much for his support, both for this event and as well for the Kanishka program as a whole. I'd also like to recognize Deirdre Collings from the SecDev Foundation. Deirdre, if you can stand up. SecDev has been both a beneficiary of Kanishka funding, as well as having run several programs that have looked into the role of social media and radicalization in Canada, and importantly has worked with Syrian communities inside of Syria in terms of making the voices that actually had other alternative narratives to come to the fore. So thank you very much, Deirdre, as well. As David said, tonight's event was the launch of what we hope will become the newest of CIC's working groups, the Intelligence Futures Working Group, which really will be looking into issues such as the ones we've discussed tonight, but also others, including the advances in technology, genetics, and others that have both a disruptive factor into the security of Canada and that require a synchronized domestic and international event. And on that, I'd like to thank you, the audience, for coming out on a Tuesday night and wish you all the best. Thank you.